Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in the House today to speak to Bill C-42 and an act to amend the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Act. To begin, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important to note that New Democrats supported Bill C-42's intentions to modernize the RCMP and address issues such as sexual harassment and post-traumatic stress disorder in the force, and voted for the bill to move to committee at second reading. However, Mr. Speaker, at the committee stage, it became apparent after hearing expert witness testimony that in its current state, Bill C-42 remains deeply flawed and will not meet the laudable objectives which New Democrats support in principle, namely to resolve the long-standing issues related to the oversight at the RCMP, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Canadians' confidence in the RCMP has been tested over the past few years as the RCMP has struggled with numerous public scandals. Whether it's the multiple cases of sexual harassment which have become part of the public discourse surrounding Canada's Mounties, or other issues related to the lack of disciplinary oversight which the force has over its members, Canadians are universal in their support for the need to modernize the oversight provisions which the Commissioner of the RCMP has at his or her disposal. C-42 purports to streamline the current burdensome process of dealing with conduct and workplace problems, including abuse of authority, intimidation, and harassment, giving the Commissioner final authority in deciding what sanctions to impose. Mr. Speaker, currently, RCMP managers faced with harassment issues have two different processes they must follow, one under Treasury Board policy and one under the RCMP Act. These processes do not always align, which often leads to confusion about rights, responsibilities, and approaches available. Under C-42, the Commissioner would be granted the authority to establish a single comprehensive system for investigating and resolving harassment concerns. Mr. Speaker, while C-42 does give more power to the Commissioner over discipline and the power to establish a more effective process for dealing with harassment complaints, it remains unclear legislation alone can provide the RCMP with the overall culture change that is needed to respond specifically to allegations of widespread sexual harassment. In fact, Mr. Speaker, Commissioner Paulson has publicly stated as much, noting that legislation alone is not enough to keep public trust in the RCMP. To emphasize the point that legislation alone will not lead to the transformative changes which are truly required to reform the ongoing systemic sexual harassment at the RCMP, I'd point to a recent study on sexual harassment within the RCMP in British Columbia, which indicate problems are significantly underreported because members are too afraid of reprisal to come forward, Mr. Speaker. From my perspective, Bill C-42 will not lead to the necessary culture change needed to destigmatize the issue of sexual harassment and ensure that victims of such harassment feel comfortable bringing their issues forward. Mr. Speaker, simply, this bill does not go far enough in directly addressing the concerns of women serving in the RCMP who are calling for urgent action to foster a more inclusive and safe environment for women in the force. The word harassment still does not appear in C-42, despite NDP attempts to do so. While this bill has been introduced without the benefit of the findings of the internal general audit of the RCMP, ordered by the Commissioner that is currently underway, but not yet completed. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, while failing to specifically address these obvious concerns, the Conservatives are undertaking an approach that does not make women in the RCMP a priority. That is just wrong, Mr. Speaker. That is just wrong, particularly given the ongoing systemic instances of sexual harassment which is being actively observed on an ongoing basis. Even more worrisome, Mr. Speaker, that neglecting to reference and define harassment in the legislation is the failure to create an oversight body with any teeth, since primary investigations into incidents of death or serious bodily harm will largely be contracted out to provincial or municipal police forces, even though some have no civilian investigation body, or still conducted by the RCMP themselves, Mr. Speaker. Truly, if this government was serious about modernizing the RCMP, they would take the next steps and allow binding recommendations from oversight bodies and a full civilian investigation of the RCMP through a truly independent watchdog agency that would report directly to Parliament. Mr. Speaker, the NDP tried to amend this bill based on witness testimony to address these issues, but the Conservatives refused to directly address the issue of sexual harassment and did little to actually modernize the RCMP, as it is still hierarchical in nature with no independent civilian oversight, Mr. Speaker. Although this is an approach which the Conservatives have favoured for other areas of public policy, ensuring that complaints are addressed by an impartial third party should be at the heart of any attempt to modernize the complaint procedures for Canada's National Police Service. Mr. Speaker, the NDP believes that we can go further, ensuring that there can be clear anti-harassment policies in the RCMP, one which contains specific standards for behaviour and specific criteria for evaluating the performance of all such employees. Such a policy, Mr. Speaker, is needed to serve as a basis for a fair discipline process. Mr. Speaker, I would start to conclude by highlighting the fact that New Democrats made a genuine effort to improve the legislation before us during the committee stage. However, these attempts were rebuffed at every step of the process. New Democrats introduced 18 amendments at committee, all designed to ensure heightened transparency to address the specific issues I've mentioned throughout my time here today, namely the issue of sexual harassment and the lack of an effective oversight mechanism. Specifically, NDP members on the Public Safety Committee proposed the following, Mr. Speaker: adding mandatory harassment training for RCMP members specifically to the RCMP Act, ensuring a fully independent civilian review body to investigate complaints against the RCMP, adding a provision to create a national civilian investigative body that will avoid police investigating police. This was ruled inadmissible for some reason. Creating a more balanced human resource policy by removing some of the more stringent powers proposed for the RCMP Commissioner, and by strengthening the External Review Committee in cases involving possible dismissal from the force. However, Mr. Speaker, as it's become standard operating procedures, the government side once again took an unreasonable approach to the NDP's proposals, rejecting all 18 amendments, even though they were supported by witness testimony and were a genuine attempt at improving the legislation before us, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, New Democrats recognize the deficiency in the approach taken by the Conservative government and their outright rejection of our practical proposals to improve this legislation, and will therefore be unable to support this legislation at this time and the way it is being presented. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.